Hello and welcome to Spectator TV. My name is Lisa Hazeldine and I am the Spectator's assistant online editor. This weekend saw the European elections and Olaf Scholz's SPD party in Germany suffered the worst defeat it had had in a national election since 1949. On the other hand, the AfD, Alternative für Deutschland, came in second in the vote. The party is perceived as far-right and has been accused by various sections of German society as flirting with extremism and Nazi ideology. But just how far-right are they? And what's behind this weekend's results? Today I am joined by Katja Heuer, author of Beyond the Wall, A History of East Germany, to discuss this weekend's elections. So Katja, this is the worst defeat that Olaf Scholz's SPD party has had since 1949. Macron has responded to similar results by calling a snap election. Do you think that Scholz could do the same?
I think it's unlikely. I think the coalition will try and hang in there for a little while longer to see whether they can actually do something about this or, kind of change people's views as such. I think the situation is also slightly different since Macron isn't really kind of putting himself up for election, but, parliament basically. And that's slightly different because of the way that the German system works. So, if the same was to happen in Germany, then Olaf Scholz's own position would also be obviously under threat. And therefore, perhaps he's less likely maybe to do that. But I also think, people are going to look to regional elections that are coming up in the autumn and maybe see if that's another interim step where something can be done about this shift.
And so what is it that you think is really going on here? Do you think Europe really is shifting towards the far right?
I wouldn't say that voters are shifting as such to the far right. I think it's more that they are fed up with the status quo and don't seem to find a way through, or at least that's my impression from the German situation, where people are very deeply unhappy about a number of things. I think, immigration is very high up on the list, but also kind of social changes over the years, the fact that people feel the economy isn't working for them, issues with, the rising cost of living, housing, a number of issues basically that they feel they've been ignored on, whilst there seems to be a lot of squabbling at political level, particularly over kind of identity politics and things like that. And that's how many people feel. Not all of them are actually voting in Germany for the AfD, but some of them are. And I think that's the underlying trend that we're seeing there, is that people are basically turning away from the mainstream because they feel they've been given it another chance and another chance over the last few years, and nothing seems to be changing, whilst the situation around people is actually getting worse.
These parties that these voters are turning towards away from the mainstream, do you think it's fair to call these parties far right?
Well, I think there's a wide range of different kind of right-wing parties across Europe, and I think we shouldn't kind of put them all into the same pot or into the same box, if you will, because they are very different. And we've seen that recently, for example, with the way that Marine Le Pen, for instance, has distanced herself from the AfD when revelations came up about, people talking about, for instance, the SS, the Nazis' sort of private army, in a way that was seen as beyond the pale, and other things that came out about the AfD. So even, within the right itself, you see various different attempts, some becoming more radical, some less so. Within the AfD itself in Germany, there's a huge variation, from basically kind of small c conservative people all the way to neo-Nazis. You have the whole range basically within the party, and that is something that the leadership are trying to grapple with, but aren't really basically being able to kind of compound really into one particular political direction. So I would say that the picture is much more varied than people just saying it's a shift towards the far right. I'm not sure that is what is actually behind this.
And to focus in on the AfD more specifically, as you just mentioned, they've had far from a smooth campaign. Sort of the comments of their lead candidate, Maximilian Krach, talking about sort of the SS. He had told an Italian paper that he would never say that anyone who wore an SS uniform was automatically a criminal, which obviously in a country such as Germany, with the history it has, it was weighty comments to make. So I wanted to ask you, the AfD still did better than expected by a little margin. Why do you think that is?
Well, I think, this has always been a bit of an illusion, I think, of the center parties, that if you attack the AfD enough, or if you find enough reasons for them to be unvotable, basically, then voters will turn away from them, because the focus has been so much on the AfD rather than the reasons why people vote for them in the first place, that I think that's always been a bit of a misguided sort of judgment there. The idea that you just dig out a few scandals, effectively. We've had other revelations about them being involved in a conference where mass deportations from Germany were being discussed. There was cases of Russian and Chinese involvement. I think the idea that this was somehow going to take away from the fact that people are disillusioned with the status quo was always a bit, kind of hopeful thinking rather than reality. And I think that's now coming, to pass effectively in this election. I don't think anybody should have been surprised by the results, because the polling has almost exactly predicted that, and has done for months. And for people to think, oh, I'm sure it's not going to be quite as bad as in the polling, and kind of cite these scandals as reasons why people wouldn't vote for the AfD, I think that's not really helpful in terms of getting to the kind of reasons why people do that in the first place. And so long as parties keep thinking that way, I don't think it's going to change.
The AfD actually did the best in the former East Germany. It came top out of all of the parties. So to dig into that a little bit further, I was wondering if you could maybe explain to us why that might be the case, what factors are sort of behind that, what voters were thinking about when they were voting.
Well, this has been a trend for some time. So, you impose kind of political views or any survey or anything really onto a German map. And you see the old Germany, East Germany basically reappear, or the East German, West German divide reappear. I think what's happened in this case was that for a long time now, the AfD has actually had the East as a stronghold. So again, this isn't really a surprise as such. But when you look at where disaffected voters actually go in the old West Germany, a lot of them have simply stopped voting. So you saw millions of people that have stopped voting for the SPD and the CDU, the two main parties, actually simply becoming non-voters. Rather than turning to the other political parties en masse. Some of them have also gone to the AfD. I mean, let's not forget that East Germans only make up around sort of 17, 18% of the population. So for the AfD to come out as the second strongest party overall, many West Germans have turned to them as well. So that's something, that is easily forgotten in this. But I think in the East, more people, rather than not voting, basically have turned away from the mainstream parties and turned towards the AfD. And that, I think, is the main kind of trend behind that. I think on the whole, East Germans are much more sensitive towards when democracy isn't working for them. I mean, they basically came to this whole system as a fresh, new kind of participant of that. And with that, you have a fresh new view of it. You don't kind of grow up with the idea that it's not perfect, none of the political parties are really what you want, and you don't kind of, in the way that Western people do, accept that as part of the system and kind of just hold your nose and vote anyway. But East Germans, have kind of dreamt about democracy and about kind of having a free system for decades. And then when it appeared, it didn't turn out to be what they were hoping it to be. And so the disillusionment is much, much bigger. And then a last dimension of this is just the economic imbalance between East and West as well. It's still very much the case that people earn less, they have less financial security, they inherit less. That there was basically no private property of any kind of large scale in East Germany before 1990. So people haven't really got savings or large inheritance or property or anything like that to fall back on when things go wrong. So there's a huge sensitivity towards economic issues as well in the East that isn't quite the same in the West. And I think these factors kind of all roll into one, and you end up with a greater willingness basically to vote for radical solutions to the problems that people see.
Another quite fascinating demographic trend is how young people in Germany have been voting, because something like between 17 and 18% of all those between the ages of 16 and 35, I think it is, voted for the AfD in this election. And this, of course, is the first European election where Germans aged 16 and 17 could vote as well. So I was just wondering what you think might be behind that. What's behind this young shift to the right? Is it a rejection of sort of, progressivism and everything that's woke?
I think it's always been a bit of an illusion when people think, of young people as these kind of centrist, moderate, Europhile, liberal people who will kind of just set the path back straight to where it was. I think people forget that young people tend to be more radical. They tend to be more angry when things aren't right, because again they're kind of newcomers to the world, and they look at things and they think, how can this be that way, and they get very angry about things that they perceive to be unjust, rather than becoming sort of cynical like older people are, and then just kind of living with the with the consequences of a world that isn't quite right. So I think that's one dimension. I wouldn't quite say that it's a shift to the right as such, because you also saw lots of them going to lots of other political parties. The vote seems to be more splintered amongst young people. So there's lots of kind of smaller parties, like Volt springs to mind, which is sort of like a left-leaning, almost like a more radical version of the Greens in lots of ways, which was also quite popular with them. So I think it's more distributed really amongst the young, because they do look for kind of a more direct fit of what they actually want. They're not kind of happy to just go vaguely in the direction either progressive or conservative in the way that older people are, because they're used to a system like that. So I think what we're seeing is a very disillusioned kind of cohort of young people who want change, and kind of want quite drastic change, and to them the kind of let's carry on as usual politics of the center ground doesn't work anymore, and so they've gone off, I think, in different directions to find quite drastic solutions to the problems that they see.
In terms of how the AfD is perceived in Germany, I was wondering if you could give us a little bit of insight into that, because some of its leading politicians have been quite controversial. One of their leading local politicians was recently on trial for the use of sort of Nazi reminiscent language. I was just wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how they're perceived in Germany, and also kind of how that looks in the context of Germany's history, that this is a party that has sort of been accused of flirting with extremism and sort of Nazi ideology and rhetoric.
Yeah, I think there's a huge sensitivity around kind of right wing politics in general in Germany because of its own history. So you saw, for instance, mass demonstrations earlier in the year on the streets of Germany, east and west, against the AfD, where basically AfD, the party itself and its voters were called sort of Nazis and fascists, and the demonstrations kind of phrased themselves as anti-fascist demonstrations, because you obviously do have that specter hanging over Germany all the time. I was also quite struck by a kind of cover that one of the leading political magazines in Germany, Der Spiegel, had a couple of weeks ago, when the German constitution had its 75th birthday, and they basically had a cover with the modern German flag, the black, red, and gold, draped over a swastika, and the headline was, "Haven't we learned anything?" And again, this was kind of the idea that Germany shouldn't lurch to the right, because of its past. Right there, basically from a magazine that is sort of perceived to be the voice of the political establishment in lots of ways. So, there is a fear that that means kind of neo-fascism coming back, and you see that quite, not just with kind of ordinary people, but also with politicians as a rhetoric. This also means that the other political parties are basically appealing to voters to vote for them, not for their political programs, but because they're not the AfD. So you get a lot of sort of messaging along the lines of vote any of the democratic parties, ideally for us, but we don't really care anymore so long as it's for any of the sort of parties that are perceived to be the sort of decent center ground. So there's a real fear there. And the problem with that, of course, is that it moves totally away from the content that people care about. The reason, as I said before, isn't really so much that people want necessarily a shift to the far right. I think it's very fundamental things that aren't going right for people, and they don't know where to take that anger and that discontent. And for the other parties now to move so far away from content, from solutions, from approaches to actually solve these things, and simply say you can't vote for the AfD because look, they're saying Nazi things and they're neo-Nazis, and we just can't have that in Germany, isn't solving any of the problems that people, very deeply care about and that they're quite desperate about in some cases. So to me, this is a trend that isn't overly helpful, and this sort of overlay of history into politics that is often done in very crude ways is more of a hindrance towards kind of finding back to a democratic system that works for people rather than kind of solving these issues.
And one of the AFD's sort of less well-known policies is the idea that they want a referendum on leaving the EU, if I have that correctly. And so I was wondering, off the back of that, so what's the state of Euroscepticism in Germany? Is it a popularly sort of held thought that Germany's time in the EU might be up should they sort of reconsider their membership of the bloc?
I think the AFD are a little bit delusional on that, if I'm honest, because, even with the election yesterday, they came out immediately and said this is a vote against Europe, or this is a vote against the bureaucracy in Brussels and so on. You'll actually find that if you look at surveys and things, that people on the whole haven't got sort of extremely strong views on Europe. I mean, this is largely to do with the fact that a lot of German law is simply becomes European law, and so the changes within Germany aren't all that great. To give a very bland example, the Burgundy passports that were often used as a sort of evocative issue in Britain, where people said they want back to their blue passports. They are burgundy because German passports have always been burgundy. So it's not a change basically if the EU adopts adopts that to the rest of the bloc. To Germans, it doesn't feel that there's as much interference as it does to other countries, I would say. So when you look at surveys, the vast majority of people still still think on the whole it works for them. It's not something that they would kind of go out of their way to change. I think the issues are much more domestic. It's things like immigration, it's the state of the economy, it's the energy crisis that came out of the war in Ukraine, and those sorts of things, that people care about rather than Europe. So if the AFD now go and make that their main thing, I would say then that might lose them support rather than gain it, because people don't necessarily vote for them because they want a more Eurosceptic sort of approach to things. I mean, obviously it's tied in with some of the kind of, dynamics that we see elsewhere, like elites versus the people, kind of city versus countryside type things, a deeply kind of anti-climate sort of sentiment as well that is quite widespread. Those things obviously tap into the European dynamics as well, but I wouldn't say that that's in the foreground of the reason why people voted for the AFD.
We're now 18 months or so, less than, out from the German federal election. So I wanted to ask, do you think that the results that we saw over this weekend was a protest vote, or is it a taste of what's to come when Germany next goes to the polls?
I think that completely depends on what happens over the next 18 months, because we've seen the AFD vote in particular fluctuate so much. People forget that this recent surge in support is a recent surge in support for the AFD. I mean, that was literally sort of over the last year or so that it's almost doubled basically. And at times they were at over 20% in the polls. Now they're back to sort of 16, 17, 18%. So, a lot of AFD voters aren't entirely sure whether that's the right choice. Many of them do see it as a protest vote. Others don't. They've kind of had residual support, I would say, at about 10%. Or so, but that means that there's another 10% or so completely up for grabs, and a lot of non-voters as well who've turned away from the parties but not really turned towards anything else. So I think, many German voters are quite open to the idea that somebody new or something new might come up and might change their minds again. I think there's an awful lot of fluctuation. And it depends entirely how the parties respond to that now. So, for example, the Conservative Union that's actually won the European elections as well. They have, I think, for a while understood that the issues that are out there are real and that people do genuinely care about them, but they don't really seem to be able to harness that vote accordingly. So we saw that some of their politicians going out saying quite populist things deliberately to try and get the voters back. So the leader Friedrich Merz, for example, came out at one point and said that refugees get better dental care than Germans even, and that was perceived to be a populist thing to say, that he only said to get voters back, so it didn't work, because people obviously want real solutions to these things. They don't want people to just come out and say something for the sake of winning an election. So it depends whether the personnel that the parties put forward, particularly the candidates to become the next German chancellor, will play a huge role, and it also depends on whether they can find some authentic people, for lack of a better word, to get these sort of issues across to people in a way that makes them believe that they genuinely might have an answer to the problems that people see. So I would hate to predict what happens in the election next year, because I think there's just so much up in the air at the moment. And that's exactly the thing that I quite often say, when German politicians and kind of opinion makers want to know about the East in particular. I think, on the whole, people are very willing still to listen to answers and aren't disengaged with the democratic principle in itself. They just want to see that somebody actually takes them seriously, thinks about what can be done about the issues that they face, and then comes up with genuine solutions, rather than just, fighting election by election, basically for voters' consent, rather than, genuinely thinking about the issues that people face.
Katja Hoyer, thank you so much for joining us on Spectator TV.